All right, so we've talked a little bit about what racism is. So let's another term that that I've heard kind of thrown around a lot over the last few months is the term systemic racism. And I kind of asked each of you in the interview what your thoughts were on that and all that type of stuff. So this is just kind of some stuff that I've come up with through my research. So systemic racism. So separate but not equal, because we know that really, separate but equal was ruled as being constitutional, but really there was no equal, right? Things were not equal. Redlining, and we already talked about the FHA Lender's Guide from 1927 to 1954, specifically outlining areas where banks were not allowed to give mortgages, and those areas were the same areas where blacks were allowed to live. Unequal pay, unequal law enforcement, unequal funding for school systems. Something that I have recently learned that I guess I was kind of aware of it, but I wasn't really fully aware. About 50% of funding for schools comes from the local taxes in that specific school district. So when you've got schools in poor communities, then you've got less tax money coming in. So, and that kind of creates that cycle. That's what we talked a little bit about earlier. Somebody brought that up. Racial profiling, which we'll get into a little bit more of that when we get into the area about the police. Natural cultural biases. We talked a little bit about the black community versus the white community and kind of how we identify each other, and we have different cultures, different viewpoints on things, the way we look at things a little bit differently. So my question is, how much of this is real today versus how much of it is perceived? So it started as early as the 1940s, affirmative action. It really kind of kicked in the 60s and was talked about a lot at that point. And there were a lot of laws put into place. Affirmative action, there were hiring quotas, college admissions quotas. You even had in 2000, the Rooney Rule put in the NFL. There are specific laws against hate crimes and discrimination laws. So a lot of the things that we perceive and we talk about when we talk about systemic racism are things that, from my viewpoint, seem like they're 40, 50 years old. But then that leads to the question, how much did the first 100 years of disadvantage affect the systemic racism that we still see today?
I think when we take a look at this from a military perspective, people go into the military and they see things that no human should see, get into all kind of battles and see limbs break off and those kind of things. And we didn't have an understanding at a certain point, but once we got to a place where we were more aware, we understood PTSD. We understood that there had to be things put in place in order to get people back in their right frame of mind. All of those kind of things, not to say that we do it well. I think that the way that this country deals with veterans is abysmal. But at least now we understand it. At least now we have a name for it. At least now we are doing GoFundMes and we're doing all these other things to get people back into a right frame of mind. And so what's happened to the black population in this country is almost totally opposite of what we do with the Jews, in that the Jews have a perspective of, never forget, never again, those kind of things. But with black people as a whole, we're told, get over it. Yeah, that was a long time ago, and so there's no kind of treatment. There's no understanding of the debilitating aspect of mentality that has matriculated through the years of people, and like I said, it hasn't even been that long ago, and the fact that so much of what has been still is. And so I think that kind of an awareness needs to be, whereas things are put in place that actually are a help, but in order for that help to happen, it has to be first of all owned as something that needs to be helped. I think a lot of things that we put in place are Band-Aids, and even when they are put in place from perspective, and it was said earlier today, you can't make somebody like you, you can't change your heart. Even when they're put in place, they're not necessarily even enforced. You know, those kind of things keep the system, the system itself racist. It's like if we all play sports, and so if you're playing basketball and your team, shoots a basket that's, way down the court and you get 3 points. But then you go down the other side of the court and that team, every time that they shoot, they get 5 points. Well, this within the system. It's very hard to win that way. And if you do win, you're that much better because the system was rigged to begin with. That's kind of what systemic racism is like. And the things that are put in place, what needs to be changed is that everybody needs to make 3 points. But that's not necessarily what we do. We end up putting a Band-Aid. Instead of changing the system, we put things within the system that are supposed to kind of make it more equal, more even, but it's still 3 points to 5 points. And the things that we put in place are not necessarily checked. Everybody turns the blind eye to what should have been. And so even that, it just continues the system going. And that's part of what the black community talks about when it talks about systemic racism, and sometimes that's what the white community, because they're not the ones perpetuating it, don't really know that it's still going on.
So help me understand, where is that today? It's very clear and easy for me to see. It's very clear and easy for me to see from 1927 to 1954 that the United States government did something to perpetuate, to disadvantage black people. It's very easy for me to see. In 2020, I don't see that clearly happening.
Well, when you take a look at, I think we talked about it earlier, the schools are still not equal. So, there are things that are still the way that they've always been. It's just that we don't necessarily deal with them, nor do we believe it's still the same. So when you go into a ghetto, when you go into the black community, when you go into these kind of neighborhoods, that the educational system is still a 3 to 5, just like the basketball, then it's really, nothing has really changed, because by the time that you graduate and you're taking the scholastics tests and all these kind of things, that you learn totally different issues, totally different ways, then the effect and the result is still continuing a system of inequality. And so it may not be seen by a lot of people, but it still exists. The undercurrent is still there. And so I'm not really sure how to make it seen, but to me it's very evident, because you should, if I have 2 10-year-olds that have gone through the public school system, they ought to have the same kind of education, but they don't. And so to me, that's not brain surgery, it's just like right in front of you. And so why don't they? Well, when you go back to their neighborhoods, you understand that the system is different for each. And in order for that to change, you'd have to make the education the same in both locales. Right. And that's not something that's being done.
Right. So go ahead, Ed.
Okay. I would say the first thing, how it's disadvantaged us, is transfer of wealth. We don't have wealth to transfer. It's done very little in our community because, A, we were prevented from owning property, from being hired or higher education. You attain a home and you attain wealth through all of that. If we were prevented from doing that, we have no wealth to transfer. So transfer of wealth has disadvantaged us. A lot.
So you're
Even in
talking about
2020,
historically,
even in
right?
2020, transfer of wealth has disadvantaged us.
So you're talking about historically, the transfer of wealth
Yes.
over the last 100 years?
All the way up to now, transfer of wealth.
And I think that's the point. It's not historical, it's factual and actual today. So in this perception of many, it is a historical thing. In the reality of the situation, it's an actual today thing. And so the numbers are out there for anyone to know. So that means that since the numbers are there, we should understand them and then circumvent them, do something that shifts it. Now, I think the answers onto how you shift it may be sometimes not palatable, but the reality is that it needs to be shifted, you know. But the wealth is not the same today. So what we come from is one thing, but what's being continued right now, it may not look like yesterday or how bad it was yesterday. It may not look like it's the same, but when you talk about inflation and everything else, it really ends up being the same anyway.
Yeah, Pew Research is where I got that from, if you want to look that up, as far as transfer of wealth.
I would say that the, over 100 years of unequal treatment and the systems that were built up. So I think the word you're talking about is systemic. That is, systems were built to reinforce the differences that were intended to occur. And so a lot of what we see as racial differences in outcomes is a result of ongoing systemic racism. Current example is the difference in the mortality rates from the COVID-19 virus. That is due to differences in underlying health issues that are a consequence of racism, not race. Again, there's only one race. So the systems are different, and so a lot of the underlying health issues are a result of, if you can use military terms, post-traumatic stress disorders or chronic stress issues related to growing up in a very racially challenged environment. And so the systems are unequal. You talked about the school systems are unequal from first grade on through high school. In my area, there are some high schools that have a large percentage of the people leaving high schools, not with high school diplomas, but with certificates of attendance. So you can't get a job with a certificate of attendance. So the implication is that they then have to go to a GED program in order they can get to get a job at a high school level for a large number of them. It's been well documented that a number of the SAT, ACT tests are somewhat racially biased. That is, the questions on those, they work to improve those over time. But systemic racism is still with us today. It gets rephrased in terms of meritocracy. That is, you can exceed based upon your merits, but who judges your merits? And how much of your merits, as been described by others here, is your ability to conform to what the system has put in place. And if you don't conform to their guidelines, you won't succeed. Also, we will put in place issues about how you can, you succeed based upon your relationship with someone else. And so if your relationship with someone else is built upon your meeting with them outside of work, being a part of their system, but if that's not what you are about, then you won't succeed as much. You won't get the advancements, you won't get the promotions. So systemic racism still exists in many levels, and it impedes the progress of people who have equal talents, but are not given equal opportunity to achieve.
Oh, no, those were some small. It was kind of like what I told you on the phone, like being excellent isn't good enough anymore. You have to be above and beyond. You have to be phenomenal. Yeah, you have to be phenomenal. You can't be excellent anymore in order to succeed, in my opinion, inside of culture, being, try to get anywhere good. You have to be phenomenal. If you're just good or near someone's skill level, you're going to lose out.
I'm going to just piggyback on everybody. So we're trying to break down that word systemic, and I kind of think I know what you're trying to say. What's the contrast from then versus now when it's systemic, that legislation and different laws and ordinances and whatnot were very visible and written in stone. I think systemic racism has morphed in a lot of ways into cultural and what I would call cultural or subjective racism, meaning there was a system with laws, X's and O's. Everything was mapped out. Once the system gets in me, I don't really need the system anymore to tell me I need to redline or to tell me to not send funding to this school. I'm using real general examples. So now, if I'm at the hiring table, if I'm at the promotion table, if I'm at the any position in charge, a decision maker, if I see someone who I'm not comfortable with because of their look, because of their language, because of many different things, any type of difference, now it becomes, I can say, well, I just preferred this person over that one because I wasn't comfortable, but that's still what has happened is it's morphed from a hard system of rules that we can look back to historically to now this becomes a belief system that now I'm operating from, excuse me, if I'm in positions of power to make decisions. And I think we can see that in so many different areas, whether it's the NFL and the number of African-American coaches. We go up and then we go down. Whether it's, we can actually contrast from an entertainment standpoint, how many people, what is the demographic of people that entertain us in so many different varieties, but who's actually behind the cameras and who's calling the shots, who's writing the checks, who has the studios that are of note. Now we know there's a lot of different things going on with technology and the advent, thank God for many of the millennials pushing some different technologies and all that kind of stuff. But again, if my comfort level allows, if my discomfort with your difference from me can allow me to still operate systemically, it's just now internalized, if that makes sense.
You know, for sake of time, there's just so many things that I know, because I deal with this all the time in the sense of having a background with the pro-life movement and those kind of things. But, you know, what was said earlier today, as far as there were more white people that have been killed by police than black people that have been killed by police. Now, when you read that statistic, it sounds correct. But the thing is, if I have 100 white people and I have 10 black people, if you kill 5 out of each group, it's only 5. But to the black people, it's half of the people. To the white people, it's only 5%.
Right.
And so those are the things that make the numbers correct. I mean, you would have to kill 50 white people then to match the 5 of the black, because you already start off with different numbers. And those kind of things are not necessarily always placed into the equation. And so that's part of what has to be, you know, unearthed for us to understand how systemic it is. You know, if you have only a percentage that's that small compared to the larger percentage, and yet you are dismantling half of that number in a smaller area, then that becomes something that is that has to be looked at severely as to why you would have the need, or there would be the need so disproportionately. You know, and that, I think that's part of the systemic aspect that we don't understand. You know, I had a pastor friend of mine that, you know, we went to, and I'm trying to explain to him, and he didn't see it, didn't see it, and we were eating at an establishment. I said, I'm going to show it to you. Okay, so I said, look, we're sitting, we're eating, and my waitress comes up, and our waitress comes up, and I said, hey, you know what, you're doing a great job. You did this, you did this, you did this. I'm just, you know, building her up, which was all true. I said, do me a favor, can you get the manager for me? Because I wanted to, you know, so when the manager comes up, and I say, well, you know, this young lady, she did this, she did this, she did that, she's a wonderful man, she deserves a raise. And I said all of that. And then they left. I said, now, look at the restaurant. All the servers are black. All the servers are black. The manager is white. You mean to tell me that you couldn't find a black man that can run this, you know, establishment and have other while you have all these black servers, you can find a black man that with the intellect to be able to be, so it's basically what you have right now is another plantation system. He still didn't see it. And I could have made it no plainer than that. And that's kind of what you find in systemic racism, is that it has morphed and it has shifted, but the levels of authority and the dynamics and the ratios and all these kind of things still don't make any sense. You know, I was taken to a large gathering of you know, pro-life people. I mean, over 1,000 people, you know, $500 a plate or those kind of things. And they brought me in and they wanted to know, why can't we get more black pastors involved in this movement of pro-life? Because after all, it should be a black, you know, it's a black issue, those kind of things. And I said, well, you know, you took me to this function, and did you notice out of over 1,000 people, there were only 5 of us at the tables that were eating that were black? Didn't notice that. I said, did you notice that all the servers were people of color? He didn't notice that. I said, did you notice that all the people that you brought in to speak, none of them were black, except for a woman who bashed other black men? I said, did you notice that? I said, no. I said, well, see, that's the thing. You don't mind saving their bodies as long as they serve you. Why don't you save their bodies and I'll help you save their destinies? Because they were here for a purpose, and it's bigger than serving you. They threw me out. And that's part of systemic racism. We don't understand and we don't see that we're continuing the same kind of a system, it's just in a different way.